Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you've ever struggled to take a scene that you've seen outside and turn it into a photo that you can be proud of, then this video right here is for you. What I'm going to talk about today is a little mindset shift and a little change in your approach to photography, especially if you're an outdoor photographer, that's going to go from you taking images that don't quite match up to what you were trying to capture in being able to turn them into photos that you can be proud of. In fact, this little change allowed me to take some photographs around in Manchester here a couple of months ago that got picked up by Ricoh's social media team and put out onto their Instagram and brought me a lot of new followers. Before we get into that, if you don't know who I am, my name's James Johnson and I'm an amateur photographer looking to turn professional. On this YouTube channel, I'm going to be documenting all the steps that I take to go from £0 or dollars, whatever your currency is, through to becoming a full-time professional photographer. I'm going to be sharing all the tips and tricks that I learn along the way, and if that's something that you want to learn and you want to come on the journey with me, then hit the like and subscribe button so you can follow the weekly updates that I share. Okay, so when you go out taking photographs, right, we've all been in this situation where you go outside, you find this scene that screams at you, like it leaps out to you, like I've got to take this photograph. So you play with your settings, you find the right composition, you hit the shutter, and all of a sudden, you've got a picture that doesn't quite feel like it matches up, especially when you get home and you get it into Lightroom and you start doing it on the monitor and you start to think like, why does this not line up with the image that I saw outside, this amazing scene? You kind of need to understand the difference between subject and scene, or a concept that I kind of call subject versus scene. I can guarantee if you change this, if you take a slightly different approach to your photography and think in terms of subjects and less in terms of scenes, you're going to start getting better results. To understand first what the bloody hell I'm talking about, let's do a little bit of a definition of what subject is and what a scene is, right? So for me, the subject is the thing in your image that is beautiful or interesting, the thing that tells the story, the thing that your eye has gravitated to that you're trying to capture. And then you've got the scene, which is the area within which that lives, okay? So your subject is the thing that you're trying to photograph. The scene is the area, the image that lives inside of. So if we take a look at this photo here that I took in Manchester a couple of weeks ago, you'll see that the subject is somewhat the light, the bridge, and the people on it, right? These are the things that tell the story through the image. The scene is Manchester by the waterside, right? And for a lot of people that don't know Manchester, which you probably don't, this could be absolutely anywhere in the world. I have come from a writing background. I'm a freelance writer in my day-to-day life, and I have written an awful lot of stuff in my life. So I try to think of this in terms of like books and characterization, which might be useful to you as well, is that the scene can only exist because the subjects within it are doing something. Right, that's how I like to think of this problem and how I try to approach it. And that gave me a very different lens for how I wanted to approach photography. Okay, so to give you another example from the same shoot, just to give you a bit of an idea of where my head has been at with this is the scene of Atlas Bar in Manchester. I went out chasing the fog, running through the city, trying to make sure that I could catch this wave of fog towards like the end of the city where it was finally pushing out at the end of the morning. And I found this really, really nice composition. It's got a bridge, it's got the building in it, the fog. It's the same sort of lighting conditions that I took this next picture with. But this scene is really missing a subject at the moment. So if we look across to the next image, to the one that got picked up by Ricoh and shared, the only thing that's really changed, apart from the perspective where it's dropped down a little bit, is that it now has a subject. We've got this gentleman crossing the road. He's got his phone in his hand, he's cutting about, he's clearly going somewhere with purpose. You've got the same buildings, you've got the same fog, you've got virtually the same composition. However, now there is a subject in it that really draws the eye, that ties everything together. So this is that beautiful, emotional, interesting bit in the photo that exists within the scene. So that's kind of the distinction, is subject versus scene. Now, I still get caught out by this an awful lot. So when I went to Iceland a couple of weeks ago, I took this photograph, right? It was near a waterfall that lots and lots of people were taking pictures of. Everyone on my photography tour had run over to go and take pictures of this waterfall. there only seemed to be 2 or 3 places to get the picture from. So I decided to walk off elsewhere. And as we'd been driving in, I saw this beautiful scene where there was these misty mountains in the background. There was this road with different coloured cars going across it, this water leading up to it. And I thought, this is an amazing scene. This looks incredible. Now I feel like I'm in Iceland. So I walked off to the side of the road, found the composition. I thought this will create a very nice leading line into it. You've got the mountains in the background. It's going to look fantastic. I get home a couple of days later, try and edit the image, and I'm like, oh my God, it's not the image that I thought it was. But this is what a lot of us do, is we see a vista, we see a scene, and we try and capture it. We're trying to cram everything into that picture. Or we're trying to capture this entire scene that makes us go, wow, without really understanding what it is that makes up that scene, what the subject really is. So within this image, the subject is the mountains, right? For me, at least. The subject is these mountains. There's a little bit of water, creating an image of these mountains, right? Or about these mountains, sorry, than of these mountains. Now, I tried to rectify some of this in post-processing, if I can go through and try and find it. And I've done a pretty terrible job. I'm not going to lie. Like, this doesn't look great at all. But this is the sort of scene that might have worked better if I'd have gotten a little bit closer, if I'd have been able to get the mountains slightly more in focus, if I'd have been able to do something just a little bit better with this image. So what was a beautiful scene on the day ended up being an image that I can't really use, that I'm not really proud of, that I don't really feel good about. And I know we've all been there. So after this photo, I really thought, okay, let's get back into thinking of subject versus scene. What could I do instead to try and get a better image? And if I scroll through here, I managed to come up with this one as one of my next. I'm very, very proud of this image. I want to get it printed and put up on that wall. And again, this is a beautiful scene, but there's a very clear subject. The subject is the waterfall. There's a lot of focus on that. Everything that's there draws the eye to it. I've tried to make sure that this is center stage, and the scene then speaks for itself. You've got this person in the scene, but they're not the subject, but they create a sense of scale for the subject. The bird there creates another sense around the subject. Like, this is an image I'm very proud of, and I've given the subject center stage instead of what a lot of people tried to do, which was this photo from further back where obviously it's blown out, but they tried to just capture the waterfall, right? And they're the same waterfall from two very, very different storytelling perspectives, right? One they're thinking of subject and one thinking in terms of scene. Okay, so let's get into how you can fix this in the field. So as an outdoor photographer, whether that's a street photographer, landscape photographer, whatever kind of outdoor photography that you're doing, you typically have a little bit more time than like sports photographers and action photographers, right? You can look at a scene and really start to think about what it is that makes it up. Now, if your photographer's eye is screaming that you need to capture this scene, that there is something here, it is worth taking a second before you put your camera to your eye and trying to figure out what it is about this scene that really resonates with me. Is it the way that certain things interact with each other? Is it a certain emotion that it creates? Is it like a rawness to the place that you're looking at? Is it the way that the light is hitting things, and that's really, really what's interesting you? But taking a second to just look at the scene, have a step back, and go, okay, this is the subject within that scene. So I want to show you a little bit of an example of how I fixed this in the field on a recent trip to Iceland. So we went to, again, a beach. I'm not going to try and say, I think it might be Reynisfjörður. So I've just said I wasn't going to try and say it. I've tried to say it. I've butchered it. Apologies, Iceland. But this is what you would call a picture of these sea stacks, right? This is a little bit of sea, a little bit of sand, and I've just taken a picture of the things that I like. And there was lots of photographers on the one side trying to get different pictures of this, trying to get it from like the standard angle, I would say. And I was adamant that I wanted to get an image that felt different to what I'd seen there. And for me, this scene was really raw. The waves, they don't look at it on this particular image, but they were crashing very, very hard. They were coming really, really far in as well. It's quite a dangerous beach to be on. The sand was black as anything, right? It was the blackest sand that I've ever seen. I hadn't anticipated how black it was going to be. It was the same black as this microphone. And I just stood there and I thought, this is how I want to capture it. I kind of lined it up, got a bit of the sea foam in, took the image, looked at the back of my camera and was like, why does this not look how I kind of wanted it to look, right? This doesn't feel the way that I wanted it to feel. So looking at the back of the camera and trying to examine what it is about this scene, what is it about this image that I've just taken, or what is it about this scene, and why do the two things not match up? So what I really, really wanted to capture here was the contrast between the white and the black. I wanted to capture how raw the sea was, and I wanted to remove some of the distractions and focus a little bit on, like, there were some of these birds flying around as well. So I went for a little walk, tried to find some different compositions, and I eventually settled on this one. Now you can see that this is a completely different image. So by getting the camera down low, I was able to create this foreground it's blurred out a little bit. Thankfully, I think I shot this at like f6.3, so I managed to get a pretty decent depth to it, but still blur out the foreground. Create an interesting foreground that really, really, really brought out this, right? There was a lot of boring sand. So the pebbles were really interesting. That's something you don't always get on a beach. So putting the camera down in a position like that, being able to see the waves from a different angle, the angle where they're like crashing at their most raw, and still keeping this as a subject. When you look at this, this allows you to come up to here and then you almost see the sea second, or at least that's how my eye works. But thinking about this in terms of the subject, how can I make this subject the main focus of my image, create that sense of rawness that I felt, and I'm really, really proud of this. So as I say, whenever you get to a place, focus on, what do I see? Why is this screaming out to me? What are the things within the image that I'm really, really, really excited about, that I really like? And how can I make them feel more interesting? And starting to focus on how you can get that subject in a different place. The same way that like a portrait photographer might do that in the studio with someone that they're trying to show an emotion or try to tell a story about. You're doing the same, but just out in the wild. Okay, but let's say you've taken your image and you've got it back and you're trying to edit it on Lightroom and you can't figure out what's wrong with it, but you know there's an image in there, right? Or you want to try and get something out of it. Well, there are three things that you can do that are really going to help you either find the subject or draw the subject out or create sort of more focus around the subject. So the first thing is cropping. Now, one of the first things I do when I get into Lightroom is that I start zooming in on my images and I start looking around for different compositions within the image, right? Like, this is one of my favorite things to do because I've noticed just randomly by zooming in to try and check like little details or see if I can edit a person out or doing the clone stamp, that often I will find a better composition within the image. And this is a really, really good example of that because this is from the geyser pools in Iceland. The sun was gorgeous in the morning and I really, really liked the texture of this image when I took it, right? When I stood there, I was looking at the back of the camera. I really, really, really liked how that looked and felt. It had this fuzzy, warm feeling about it. And I really like detail shots, something I absolutely want to get better at over the next year or so. But this image didn't turn out great compared to how I saw it on the back of the camera. And that'll happen sometimes. So what I decided to do was start zooming in. And what I found was this crop, right? This had enough texture to it. It had the foam, the fog in there. It creates this sort of natural gradient. And this is the story that I was trying to tell with this image. So all I've done is crop this in. Now I shoot on a full frame camera for the most part. I've got my Lumix there. So cropping really isn't too much of an issue for me. If you're on like an APS-C camera or you've got a smaller sensor size, you may struggle with cropping if you want to do printing or you want to try and blow it up. But if you're using things digitally, this is something that you can still really do and benefit from. And actually this image, if I'm being honest, has become the background on my phone. Yes, I know I need to charge my phone. Hopefully that's in focus. If not, I'm going to leave it in there anyway. But yes, so this is one of my favorite images after this crop. And I do this all the time. So I highly recommend that you get in there and start looking around. Okay, so cropping's one of the things that you can do. The next thing you can do is masks and overlays. Right, this is a tip I learned from Mark Denny, so go and check out his channel as well. He's absolutely fantastic for editing tips like this. But let me go back to that Manchester image that got picked up by Rico. So one of the things that I have done here, and it's only really subtle, sorry, not on that one, on this one, slightly less subtle now you've seen the other video, the other one. However, what I've done here is anywhere that there's like dead, I've taken the exposure down. And the way that I've done this is really simply by using using linear gradients. So by taking them on, putting them onto the image and just bringing the exposure down ever so slightly. So you can see on this image here, if I bring the exposure down, it starts to bring a focus to that subject. So if that goes a little bit lighter, there's a bit more focus on the foreground. So if I bring the exposure down just ever so slightly on this, it starts to create more and more of a focus on my subject. And you could theoretically stop that anywhere. Like you could take that down a stop and a half there. I'd probably leave it a little bit higher, but enough that it starts to bring focus there. And I've done the same at the top of the image as well. With skies, it's a little bit harder because if you start adding black to the sky, it starts to look a bit weird. However, on a foggy day, this worked quite well. You could also do that by bringing the highlights down if you wanted to and things. But yeah, using that to like take away some of this dead space or create more focus on your subject can be really, really, really good. I've done that in this image as well, one that I'm pretty proud of as well. This was just taken in my local park on a dog walk, but I have used then radial gradients to bring down the exposure in the foreground. So if I take all of the masks off, suddenly you have a very, very different photo. Now that's still a nice photo. I really like how that looks, but by taking those little bits off and just gently and having this all completely blacked out, which I'll get to in a second, can be really, really good for creating more focus on your subject. So you can go from an image kind of like this to something with a lot more focus on the subject. So applying radial gradients, moving them around, finding them to fit in like dead space or areas that you don't want to focus on, bring the exposure down, maybe bring the shadows down, bring the highlights down, see what it does to the image, but take away distractions from your subject to try and make that pop a little bit more. And to bring this to the last point is you can blow out the highlights and the shadows. Now, a lot of like photography purists will absolutely hate this tip, and that's fine if you're really like a technical photographer and you like not having things feeling overexposed or underexposed, that's absolutely fine. But one tip that I absolutely love is to try and really like blow out the shadows and the highlights to create focus in your images. So that's what I've done here down the side. This is just a tree, right? But I've made it so dark that it doesn't feel out of place because it's clearly a tree, but there's nothing to draw your eye to it. There's no reason to look at that. If anything, it pushes your eye away from the tree into the subject. Now, the same can be said for if I jump to one of my images from the Glacial Lagoon. Where are we? Is this the one? Yep. So what I've done here is I've got this is, again, an image I'm very happy with. I've got the subject of all of this ice here, but there's a lot of scene to this as well. But what I've done really is blow the highlights out. So taking the highlights up dramatically to be able to blow the sky out so there's nothing here to really draw your eye at all, as opposed to going the other direction and maybe creating more texture, which a lot of us do in our photographs and can be a really nice trick. But blowing out those highlights creates this sense of negative space at the top that really drives focus to this. And I've cropped it in, so I've taken away some of the distractions towards the bottom, but blowing out the highlights just creates a different focus on the subject. So yeah, they're my tips for how you can fix that either in the field or in post-processing as well. But I want to know what you think. What do you think about the whole topic of subject versus scene? Is this a tip that you would use? Is it something that you don't really agree with and you would do something else? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you about what you think about these things. However, I found that this has massively changed how I approach photography, and when I'm out in the field now, I am really thinking in terms of subject versus scene and trying to figure out what is the subject that I'm trying to capture and how can I build the scene to make sure that I'm getting the image that I want to and that I can be proud of. Okay, I'll see you next time. Take care.